Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, and the defeat hit like a shock to the whole system. Power shifted fast. People blamed leaders, neighbours, even old friends. The city tried to pull itself back together, but trust stayed thin. Every public argument sounded like a threat. In that kind of aftermath, restoring order mattered more than being fair, and anyone who stood apart from the crowd began to look risky. Democracy had not simply rolled forward as if nothing happened. Athens had to decide who belonged, who could be trusted, and who might break the city again. Rumours and old grudges gained weight because people needed simple answers. A well-known man named Socrates kept doing what he always did, questioning claims, probing beliefs, refusing easy certainty. In calmer times, that looked like free thought. Now it looked like disrespect for the fragile recovery. Socrates did not hold office or command an army, but he influenced how younger Athenians thought, and that made him visible. He picked at assumptions that leaders depended on, and he did it in public, where others could hear and repeat it. After the war, Athens treated doubt as a luxury it could not afford. Suspicion searched for a target it could name. Socrates, openly challenging and impossible to control, became newly vulnerable to political fear. Democratic rule returned, but it returned with a memory. Athens needed someone to blame for years of fear and humiliation, and it started scanning for people who had seemed comfortable questioning everything. Socrates stood out. He had moved through the city as a relentless critic, and now that same habit looked different. In a wounded democracy, constant doubt sounded like sabotage. Resentment tightened around the people linked to him. Some of his former associates had become symbols of betrayal and abuse of power, and that association stuck, even when it ignored the messy reality of politics and friendship. In public talk, influence mattered more than proof. The suspicion shifted from what Socrates believed to what he supposedly produced: ambitious followers, contempt for tradition, and instability. So the complaint changed shape. It stopped being about an irritating old man who asked awkward questions, and it became about a threat to the city's future. Parents worried about sons who admired him. Politicians heard a rival kind of authority forming in the streets. Each time he challenged a respected figure, it felt less like philosophy and more like undermining the rules that held Athens together. Complaints about Socrates did not stay at the level of gossip forever. In Athens, a citizen could turn suspicion into a legal weapon, and that moment arrived. A formal accusation was filed, and it carried 2 sharp charges: impiety and corrupting the youth. It sounded simple, almost vague, but it was serious by design. These words did not just describe bad manners, they implied danger to the city itself. The charge of impiety meant more than private disbelief. It suggested that Socrates disrespected the gods the city relied on, and that he introduced ideas that did not belong. The second charge aimed even closer to the heart of Athens: the next generation. If young men listened to him and copied his habits of questioning, then authority weakened, tradition looked negotiable, and loyalty looked optional. The case now framed his influence as a public threat, not a personal annoyance. Once the accusations became official, everything changed. A named charge meant a scheduled process, a court, and a verdict that carried real punishment. The same city that had tolerated a provocative voice could now treat that voice as a crime. Socrates no longer faced only disapproval in the streets. He faced the power of the state measured out through law, and the consequences were not abstract. In Athens, a conviction in a case like this could end in death. The case moved from accusation to a public trial, and Socrates now stood before a huge Athenian jury made up of ordinary citizens. This was not a small panel and not a private hearing. It was the city judging him in one crowded decision. His accusers presented him as a threat to religion and to young minds. The jury then expected the usual thing: regret, caution, a request for mercy. Socrates did not give them that. His defense treated the charges as a test of right and wrong, not a problem to be managed. He challenged the logic behind the accusations and pushed the jurors to examine themselves as much as they examined him. That posture changed the temperature of the trial. It sounded less like a man trying to survive and more like a man judging his judges. Many jurors took it personally. In that moment, the courtroom stopped being only about law. It became a referendum on authority, tradition, and the limits of questioning in a shaken democracy. Socrates' refusal to flatter or soften his message narrowed the space for compromise. Doubt turned into irritation, and irritation into resolve. Some jurors who might have hesitated now saw stubbornness where they wanted humility. His strategy made one outcome far easier to reach: conviction. The guilty verdict did not end the case. In Athens, it opened a second decisive phase: sentencing. The jurors now had to choose a punishment, but the system pushed the accused to help shape that choice. The prosecutors proposed a penalty, and Socrates was expected to answer with a serious alternative. This was the moment for a practical compromise, something that looked like regret, or at least restraint. Instead, Socrates treated sentencing as another test of principle. He did not offer the kind of humble, workable punishment the court expected. He did not present himself as a man who had learned his lesson. His counter-proposal sounded, to many jurors, like defiance. Almost like he still claimed the higher ground after being convicted. That changed the emotional math of the room. It turned uncertainty into impatience. The result was simple and brutal. Jurors who might have accepted exile or a substantial fine now faced a choice between force and weakness, at least in their eyes. By refusing to play the normal role of a condemned man, Socrates narrowed their options. His stance made a lighter sentence feel like surrender. And in that climate, the harshest penalty became easier to justify and easier to vote for. The sentence did not end with a sword or a noose. Athenian law required a different kind of killing: a drink. The method mattered because it turned death into a procedure the city could manage. This was not a mob attack, and it was not left to chance. The state chose a poison as its tool, and the name of that poison carried weight: hemlock. Hemlock worked because it seemed simple. It came as a prepared dose, measured and delivered under supervision. In that choice, Athens kept control from start to finish, over timing, over the body, over the public meaning of the punishment. The execution looked orderly, even restrained. But the order hid a harder truth. The city did not just condemn a man, it administered his death. That was the link the law created: civic judgment, enforced through a toxin. Once the court selected death, the rest followed like paperwork. Hemlock turned a legal decision into a physical certainty, a punishment that entered the bloodstream and did its work from the inside. There was no struggle with a weapon, no need for force at the final moment. The law itself carried the poison to the condemned. The verdict had already set the end point, but the timing had slipped out of ordinary hands. Socrates stayed in prison, not because Athens hesitated, but because the city followed a religious calendar that paused executions during a sacred mission. Days passed, and that delay mattered. It created breathing room. It turned a fixed sentence into a waiting period, long enough for other people to start asking a dangerous question: what if he never drank the poison at all? His friends did not treat the delay as comfort. They treated it as a window. They gathered, measured risk, and built a practical plan around the simple fact that prisons relied on people. Guards who could be persuaded, routines that could be predicted, gates that opened for the right reasons. Money entered the picture, so did trust. The plan did not need to defeat the law in court anymore. It only needed to move one man from custody to freedom before the state called time. The closer the sacred mission came to ending, the more urgent everything became. Every day of waiting brought the city nearer to the moment when hemlock would be administered as procedure, not passion. For his friends, the escape plan hardened into the first real alternative to an official death. It meant roots, contacts, and a new life outside Athens, far from the reach of the sentence. And for the first time since the trial, the poison stopped being inevitable and became a choice that could be avoided. The escape plan had looked simple on paper. Get him out quietly, get him away from Athens, let time do the rest. But Socrates refused to treat the verdict like a mistake that could be dodged. He saw a choice, not a trap. If he fled, he had lived by arguments while abandoning them when they finally cost something. That gap mattered to him more than survival. He treated the law as a binding commitment, even when the law turned against him. He had benefited from the city's rules for decades, and he believed he had no right to break them only when they became painful. Escape also carried a second price. It would have turned him into a wanted man, and it would have taught his students that force beat principle. He rejected that lesson. So the execution stopped being something done to him and became something he accepted on purpose. He used the time left to show what he had claimed all along, that a good life depended on integrity, not comfort, not fear. The coming cup of hemlock had stood as the state's punishment. In his hands, it also served as a final demonstration. Belief turned into action. The sentence finally became action. Socrates took the state's hemlock, not as a surprise attack, but as the official method Athens used to end a life. The point of the poison was control. It let the city carry out death without blades or public chaos. He drank, and there was no last-minute reversal. The punishment moved from words in court to chemistry in his body. The change came steadily. Hemlock did not burn like an acid or strike like a venom. It worked by shutting down movement step by step until a person could not act even if the mind stayed clear. The paralysis climbed upward, turning simple motions into impossibilities. Breathing grew harder as the muscles that did it weakened. In the end, the body stopped obeying, and life ended by silence, not violence. What happened next mattered almost as much as the death itself. The details were written down and repeated, with the poison at the center, so the execution became a lesson people carried forward. Hemlock turned into a symbol of lawful killing, measured and authorized. Socrates' choice to accept it became a story about conscience under pressure. One administered cup of poison became a cultural reference point for centuries. In the centuries that followed, the hemlock death stopped being only an Athenian punishment and started becoming a reference point. People treated it like evidence. It showed what a state could do when it held both legal authority and the tools to kill cleanly, on schedule, without bloodshed. The method looked controlled, even civilized. The meaning behind it did not. It raised a hard question that never went away. Socrates' end became a symbol used far beyond Greece. Writers and reformers used it to warn that criticizing the powerful could be recast as a public threat. His case helped frame modern arguments about free speech, especially the fear that unpopular ideas could be punished as moral harm. At the same time, governments pointed to legal process and order, insisting that a trial and a sentence made violence lawful. That tension fed straight into debates about execution itself. Supporters of capital punishment treated the hemlock as an early example of a humane death, managed by the state rather than by a mob. Critics saw something darker, a system that turned obedience into a final requirement and poison into an administrative tool. The contrast stayed sharp. Athens once acted from fragility and fear, and the world kept repeating the story to measure power.